Now that Mr Hyde has been found dead and Dr Jekyll seems to have disappeared, it's time for the truth. Mr Utterson is about to read 2 letters addressed to him, one from the late Dr Lanyon, the other from Dr Jekyll himself. Dr Lanyon's letter will explain why, in the weeks before his death, he cut all contact with Dr Jekyll. It all began with a letter from Dr Jekyll. In it, Dr Jekyll requested an urgent favour, emphasising that it was a matter of life and death. Dr Lanyon had to cancel whatever plans he had and travel directly to Dr Jekyll's house. Mr Poole, Dr Jekyll's butler, would be awaiting Dr Lanyon's arrival, along with a locksmith. Dr Jekyll's express wishes were that they force entry into his office, but Dr Lanyon must enter the office alone. Once inside, Dr Lanyon then had to open the document cabinet, breaking the lock if necessary, and remove one of the drawers and all its contents. This included some powders, a file, and a book. Dr Lanyon then had to take the entire drawer home and wait. On the stroke of midnight, a man would visit Dr Lanyon on behalf of Dr Jekyll. Dr Jekyll was very clear. If Dr Lanyon refused to help or bungled the task, it would directly result in Dr Jekyll's madness or death. Naturally, Dr Lanyon was convinced that Henry Jekyll was already insane, but, as an old friend, he did everything exactly as instructed. He accessed the office and retrieved the drawer. Its contents all looked fairly innocent: some crystalline white salt, a phial of blood-red liquor that smelled really bad, and some other vague ingredients. What was Dr Jekyll working on? As foretold in the letter, a small-statured man arrived at Dr Lanyon's house at midnight. He desperately wanted to know whether Dr Lanyon had retrieved what was needed. He was barely controlling his hysteria. Dr Lanyon, who was initially repulsed by the small man, took pity on him. Lanyon pointed to the drawer, and the small man darted at it, overcome with relief. He then asked Dr Lanyon to bring him a glass, into which he mixed the ingredients from the drawer. The solution bubbled and boiled, dramatically changing colour before their eyes. Once the mixture was a watery green, the small man set the glass down and turned to Dr Lanyon. With great relish, he declared how the narrow-minded Lanyon was about to witness a miracle of science. He then tilted his head back and drank the potion in one big gulp. What followed shocked Lanyon to his core. The small man cried, staggered, and clutched at the table. He gasped for air as his face swelled, turned black, and his features melted. Dr Lanyon sprang back, shielding his eyes from the horror, and then came the sickening reveal. The small man had transformed into Dr Henry Jekyll. At this point in his letter, Dr Lanyon refuses to reveal what he and Dr Jekyll discussed for the next hour. It's too awful for Lanyon to recall, and he was convinced that he'd never recover from the shock. Sadly, he was right. Poor Dr Lanyon. All that's left now is for Mr Utterson to read Dr Jekyll's letter. It contains his full statement of the case. Dr Jekyll begins by describing his origins. He was born into a very wealthy family, growing up to be cultured and well-educated. He was disciplined, enjoyed doing good deeds, and basked in the high esteem of his peers. But in his heart of hearts, Jekyll knew that there was another side to his personality, a darker half that craved unspeakable depravity. Finally, Dr Jekyll came to accept his own duality without moral judgment. He also longed to find a way to separate the two sides of his personality. That way, his good side could be free from the danger and shame brought by his bad side, while his bad side would be free from restraint and repression. But how could this be scientifically possible? This is the question that guided Dr Jekyll's experiments in transcendental medicine. a mystical branch of science that Dr Lanyon disapproved of. Eventually, Dr Jekyll discovered his unholy grail, substances that could transform him and grant him his wish. But Jekyll doesn't reveal his exact scientific process for two important reasons. Firstly, he realised far too late that our attempts to discard our natural burdens makes them return with a vengeance. Secondly, because Jekyll's discoveries were incomplete. Even when Jekyll had the drug at hand, it was a long time before he drank it. The risks were enormous. What if he overdosed and died? But the temptation of knowing consumed him, and one day he finally drank it. The agony was immediate. His bones felt like they were being ground together, and he was hit with waves of terrible nausea. Then, just as quickly as it all came on, it subsided. Seeing himself in the mirror, he had become Mr Edward Hyde, and it felt good. He could see how other people might find Hyde repulsive. After all, he was the only human being to ever exist that was entirely evil. Now came the second part of the experiment. He mixed the solution and drank it again. This restored the face and body of Dr. Henry Jekyll. Success! And just like that, the floodgates opened. Henry Jekyll now possessed the intoxicating power to inhabit a second physical form. This different body still felt natural to him, but it was as ugly as the evil desires it fed on. So, Jekyll prepared for his double life. He furnished a house in Soho, engaged a secretive housekeeper, and ordered his own staff to obey Mr Hyde. Jekyll also drew up a will that gave everything to Mr Hyde. That way, if Hyde became the dominant entity, he would still live comfortably. With everything arranged, Jekyll enjoyed his new freedom. Hyde's existence meant that Jekyll could have the best of both worlds, disgusting depravity and a flawless reputation. Of course, Hyde's evil deeds continued to escalate. Sometimes Dr. Jekyll would cringe at the memories of what he did as Mr. Hyde, but as time passed, Mr. Hyde's actions bothered him less and less. Dr. Jekyll recalls when Mr. Hyde trampled the little girl. All he learnt from that was that Mr. Hyde needed his own bank account. But one day, to his horror, Dr. Jekyll woke up in his own bed as Mr. Hyde. Hyde quickly made an antidote for himself and was restored to Jekyll in time for breakfast. This was a new problem. Never had he turned into Mr. Hyde without the drug, but recently he was finding that he had to increase the dose of his solution for it to work. Once he even tripled the dose, at the risk of death. It seemed that the more time he spent in the body of Edward Hyde, the stronger Hyde became. In fact, he was taking over. Dr. Jekyll had to make a choice. Would he continue to feed and strengthen Mr. Hyde? Or would he commit to the respectable form of Dr. Jekyll? As Jekyll, he would struggle with repressed cravings for the rest of his life, whereas Mr. Hyde wouldn't even miss Dr. Jekyll. And so, Dr. Jekyll reluctantly gave up Mr. Hyde and endeavoured to live a good life. But he couldn't quite bring himself to get rid of Mr. Hyde's clothes, home, or housekeeper. For 2 months, everything seemed to go well, but temptation returned. Jekyll felt Hyde struggling for freedom. And so, in an hour of weakness, Jekyll drank the potion and unleashed the beast. After being caged for 2 months, Mr. Hyde came out roaring. And sure enough, that very night, he clubbed Sir Danvers Carew to death, relishing every blow. But the reality of the situation hit Mr. Hyde as soon as the deed was done. He rushed back to Soho and destroyed his papers. He then ran to the lab, took the drug, and transformed back into Jekyll. Dr. Jekyll finally realised that no act of self-indulgence was worth the evil that Mr. Hyde was capable of. Plus, Hyde was now a wanted man, and his penalty, if caught, would be the noose. And so Dr. Jekyll redoubled his efforts to live well and do good in the community. But from time to time, in secret moments of weakness, Jekyll still hungrily indulged in the memories of Hyde's wickedness. One morning, as he enjoyed the sun in Regent's Park, Dr. Jekyll suddenly felt terribly sick. The shivering and nausea passed quickly until he realised that he was Mr. Hyde once again. Stranded in public, far from his lab, and with a death sentence hanging over his head, Hyde had to act fast. He found refuge at a hotel and, knowing he could still write in Jekyll's hand, sent letters to Dr. Lanyon and Mr. Poole. This arranged for the transfer of his drugs to Dr. Lanyon's that night. His fellow scientists' horror at seeing the transformation sparked terror in Dr. Jekyll too. This could never happen again. Unfortunately, the very next morning, Dr. Jekyll turned into Mr. Hyde once more. This time, he needed a double dose to return to Dr. Jekyll. Then, only 6 hours later, he became Mr. Hyde again and had to re-administer the drugs. This began Jekyll's prolonged battle to remain himself. If he slept or the medication wore off, Mr. Hyde would roar back to life. To make matters worse, when Mr. Hyde took control, he would play tricks on Dr. Jekyll, vandalising his books, burning letters, and even destroying a portrait of his father. Inevitably, Dr. Jekyll's supply of the drug began to run low, but no amount of searching through all the chemists of London could get a key ingredient for him. Dr. Jekyll believed that the success of his first batch was due to an unknown impurity. It was impossible to find it now. Dr. Jekyll wrote this letter to Utterson under the influence of the last dose of the original potion. Soon, Mr. Hyde would take full control. This was the true death of Dr. Henry Jekyll. How can a mystery as deep as this leave us feeling more afraid than when we started? What has Dr. Jekyll revealed to us about the sinister things that linger in our very souls? Perhaps we should thank Dr. Jekyll for walking a doomed path for us. He's helped us understand something important about ourselves. Are you ready to confront your dark side? We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.